Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise Windsor, the Princess Royal, the most tireless working royal in the history of the British monarchy, the woman who has carried the weight of the Crown's obligations with a ferocity that has humbled prime ministers and silenced critics for more than 5 decades, has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by stepping into a role that shatters every precedent the palace machinery has spent centuries carefully constructing. In a move that has left constitutional scholars scrambling for their Blackstone, loyalists weeping quietly in the corridors of Clarence House, and the broader nation frozen mid-breath before their television sets, King Charles III has granted his sister, the Princess Royal, an authority so sweeping, so historically resonant, and so devastatingly personal in its implication that even the most hardened Fleet Street veterans confess they never saw it coming. She is now Royal Regent in all but the most technical of definitions, empowered, constitutionally anchored, and unmistakably elevated to a position that places the entire machinery of the British state upon her capable, unchosen, and yet somehow always prepared shoulders. But the question that has silenced the nation is not simply what she has been granted. It is what she has always known, and what the palace has spent decades making certain the public would never understand. What exactly did Charles predict about the monarchy's survival that compelled him to reach for his sister above all others? Why did the institution's most powerful unseen architects explicitly forbid this kind of permanent elevation for so long, and what terrifying precedent does it now shatter? And what dark hidden truth about Anne's lifetime of silent grinding sacrifice finally forced the king's hand in the most consequential constitutional gesture of his reign? The morning it became official arrived on London like a held breath released. A pewter sky pressed low over the Thames, dragging a curtain of November mist across the embankment and turning the Portland stone of Buckingham Palace the color of old bone. Frost had settled overnight on the iron railings of St. James's Park, each spike crowned with a thin sleeve of white that caught the first pale light and refracted it into something almost ceremonial, as though the city itself had dressed for an occasion it did not yet have words for. Inside Clarence House, where the king had taken to conducting his most private constitutional business in the past 18 months, the atmosphere was one of suffocating, deliberate calm. The building's high ceilings absorbed sound in a way that made every footstep feel ecclesiastical. The mahogany-paneled library on the first floor, a room that had witnessed the private council of Queen Elizabeth II, the anguished debates of Philip Mountbatten, and the early sovereign musings of a young Prince Charles, was now occupied by 2 people, its Persian rugs anchoring the silence, its Van Dyck portraits staring down with expressions that had, over 3 centuries of monarchy, learned to register nothing. On the leather-topped desk near the window sat an envelope. It was cream-colored, the precise shade of unbleached linen, and it bore a wax seal of deep burgundy, almost crimson in the sharp morning light, pressed with a crest that very few people alive had ever seen outside of the restricted archives of the College of Arms. The seal was old. It was not the current royal crest, with its lions and unicorns in their familiar heraldic postures. This was an older iteration, used by the councillors of state in their most formal constitutional communications, its edges worn smooth from decades of pressing, its details slightly blurred by the accumulated weight of history. The envelope itself was thick, the kind of paper that resists tearing, the kind that was made to last longer than the hands that signed it. A single name was written across the front in a hand that, to anyone who had ever received correspondence from the monarch, was unmistakably, achingly, his, sloping forward with the careful pressure of a man who understood that what he wrote might one day be read by historians. The name on the envelope was simply Anne. She had been standing near the window when it was placed before her, watching the frost on the park railings begin its slow morning surrender to the pale warmth of a sun that gave light without heat. Her posture was what it had always been, bolt upright, shoulders squared with a precision that spoke not of affectation, but of decades of physical discipline, of equestrian competition and military service, and the relentless commitment to standing tall in every room the monarchy had ever placed her in. She was 73 years old, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without comment, without ceremony, without the slightest invitation for observation. When she turned from the window and saw the envelope, her face performed none of the theatrical responses that the occasion might have demanded. There was no sharp intake of breath, no trembling lower lip. There was only a long, still moment in which her eyes rested on the cream-colored paper as though reading something written beneath the surface of the wax, some message encoded in the burgundy seal that predated language and operated instead at the frequency of duty, of blood, of 50 years of unbroken service. "Your Royal Highness," said the man standing near the door, Sir Geoffrey Larkspur, the king's most senior constitutional advisor, a figure of such institutional invisibility that most palace correspondents had spent 20 years writing around him without ever writing about him. He was dressed in his characteristic charcoal suit, so precisely pressed that it appeared less like clothing and more like a structural element of the room. His Oxford shoes, black and mirror-finished, caught the gray light from the window. His clipboard, always the clipboard, tucked under his left arm like a shield or perhaps a weapon, was held with the kind of stillness that suggested long practice in waiting. His eyes were pale gray and calm, with the terrible calm of a man who had operated for decades in the space between power and its exercise, shaping decisions that shaped history from a position so recessed within the institutional machinery that even the most determined investigative journalists had never managed to bring him fully into focus. "The document is ready," he said. His voice carried no warmth, no ceremony. It was the voice of a mechanism engaging. Anne looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for people who stated the obvious in rooms where she was the most experienced person present. She crossed to the desk, stood before the envelope, and said nothing for a moment that stretched across the library like a cathedral ceiling. Then, in a voice that was low and gravelly and weighted with something that had nothing to do with the occasion's formality and everything to do with its personal history, its decades of personal history, she spoke. "For 53 years, she said, the world has spoken for me, about me. Decided what I was for." She paused. In the doorway, Sir Geoffrey Larkspur's clipboard arm stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Today, my brother is speaking for me. And today, finally, I am going to speak for myself." 20 million people would eventually watch the footage of that morning. The broadcast, routed through the BBC's Constitutional Affairs Division, cleared by the Privy Council's Communications Office, and transmitted via encrypted satellite uplink to networks across 47 countries, was presented with a restraint so extreme it felt almost aggressive. No music, no commentary during the key moments, just the camera, the cream-colored room, and the Princess Royal's hands as they broke the burgundy seal on the envelope that would, within 72 hours, reshape the public understanding of what the British monarchy had been enduring in private for 3 years. In pubs across Edinburgh, pint glasses were set down and not picked up. In a hospital ward in Cardiff, a night shift nurse paused her rounds and stood in the corridor, watching a wall-mounted screen with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though steadying her own heartbeat. In Montecito, California, it was still the previous evening, and a household that had spent years at war with the institution now being broadcast across the world was, by several accounts, conspicuously quiet. The story of Anne's elevation did not begin in that cream-colored room. It did not begin in the autumn of 2022, when Parliament passed the Councillors of State Act and quietly expanded the list of working royals authorized to perform constitutional duties in the sovereign's absence. It did not begin even in the complicated winter of 2023, when the King's health first entered the public record with a disclosure that was as carefully managed as it was genuinely alarming. It began, in the way that most true things begin, decades earlier, in a conversation so private that only 2 people were present to hear it, and one of them was now a king, and the other had spent 50 years carrying the weight of what was said with a composure so total that the weight had become invisible. The year was 1974, and Britain was exhausted in the way that nations sometimes become when they have survived too many consecutive crises without sufficient time for grief. The IRA's campaign had made London feel perpetually braced for catastrophe. The 3-day week had left the country feeling simultaneously darkened and compressed, as though the crisis were physical, a hand pressed against the chest of the nation. At Sandringham, in the long drawing room that faced the frost-covered parkland of the Norfolk estate, 2 siblings sat in the particular silence of people who have grown up together and no longer need to perform ease in each other's presence. Charles was 25, lean and earnest in the way of young men who have been told since birth that their purpose is to become something vast and are not yet certain they are equal to it. Anne was 23, recently returned from the Munich Olympics, already carrying the particular authority of someone who has competed at the highest level and discovered that the thing she feared, failure in front of the world, was survivable. Outside, the grounds were locked in a January cold that turned the grass silver and made the oak trees look like they had been carved from the same stone as the house. A fire burned in the drawing room's enormous grate, but it seemed to illuminate rather than warm, throwing long orange shadows across the furniture, making the room feel more like a stage than a refuge. Charles said something that Anne would remember for the rest of her life. He said it quietly, without drama, in the tone of someone thinking out loud rather than delivering a prophecy. He said, "If it ever falls apart in the way I think it might, if the machinery turns on itself the way I believe it's capable of, I want you beside me, not behind me, beside me." He looked at the fire when he said it, not at her, but Anne understood. She had always understood him, in the way that siblings who have been raised inside the same impossible inheritance develop a kind of shorthand for the things that cannot be said in full sentences. She said nothing in return. She simply nodded, once, with the gravity of someone accepting a commission, and that nod, unremarked upon by anyone else in the world, was the beginning of everything. 50 years later, in the mahogany library at Clarence House, Anne's hands did not tremble as she opened the envelope. This was remarkable, given what was inside. Remarkable enough that Sir Geoffrey Larkspur, a man who had trained himself to observe without appearing to observe, found himself watching her fingers with something close to awe. The paper she drew from the envelope was thick and cream-colored, matching its container, and it was headed with the royal cipher in a way that was unmistakably official and yet, in this context, felt almost unbearably personal. It was a letter. Not a constitutional instrument, not a formal designation. Those had already been prepared by the Privy Council and were waiting in their own leather folder on the desk's right-hand side. This was a letter in the king's own hand, written, as Anne would later confirm, in the single brief statement she would issue through her private secretary, over the course of 3 evenings in the private rooms at Balmoral, during a period when the king had been resting under medical instruction, and the television had remained dark, and the fireplace had burned through the long Highland evenings, with the patient indifference of something that had been burning for centuries. The letter was 4 pages long. Anne read all of it standing. She did not sit, she did not move from the spot in front of the desk, except that at some point, Sir Geoffrey would later be unable to say precisely when, her left hand came to rest against the desk's surface, not gripping it, just touching it, as though drawing stability from the solidity of the mahogany, from the grain of a wood that had been here through so much, and had absorbed it all without complaint. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the bracket clock on the mantelpiece was audible from across the room, a slow, measured ticking that seemed, in the silence, to be counting something more significant than seconds. What the letter contained would not be read aloud in full during the broadcast. What was shared, carefully, deliberately, in the controlled fragments that Anne permitted, was enough. The king had written, in the sloping hand that had signed 10,000 documents and 10,000 condolences, and the occasional private note, that no archivists would ever catalogue, that he had been thinking about the monarchy's continuity with an urgency that the public management of his illness had never fully conveyed. He had been thinking about what it meant to be unavailable, not the constitutional abstraction of it, but the lived reality of it, the experience of watching from a sickbed, as the institution he had spent his life preparing to lead continued its operations, continued its appearances, continued its relentless forward motion with or without him at its center. He had been thinking about trust, about the architecture of trust inside the palace machinery, about who could be relied upon not merely to perform the duties of the crown, but to understand them, to feel their weight, to carry them without resentment or calculation. And he had arrived, with the clarity that serious illness sometimes forces upon its subjects, at a conclusion he had been moving towards since a drawing room in Norfolk in January 1974. The conclusion was Anne. She was not a surprise. This was important. This was in fact the most important thing. The thing that separated this moment from the tabloid version of itself that the more sensational corners of the media would construct in the hours that followed. Anne's role as a counselor of state was not new. It was not a crisis measure improvised in response to a health emergency. The Councillors of State Act of 2022, passed through Parliament with relatively little public fanfare amid the final difficult months of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, had been a piece of constitutional engineering whose quiet significance most political commentators had not paused long enough to appreciate. It had expanded the pool of working royals authorized to perform the sovereign's constitutional duties in cases of incapacity or absence, adding both Anne and Edward to a list that had previously excluded them by virtue of their place in the line of succession. The legislation was sensible, practical, and long overdue. It was also, as those close to the king had always understood, a direct reflection of his trust, not in the abstract category of working royals, but in his sister specifically. What the act had done, legally, was create the framework. What Charles had done, over the 3 years of his reign that had been shadowed by his illness, was fill that framework with the substance of his confidence. Anne had been deployed with increasing frequency and increasing constitutional weight. She had represented the sovereign at events where the symbolism of that representation carried genuine diplomatic significance. She had conducted audiences, signed documents, and performed the specific constitutional rituals that could only be performed by someone operating with the full delegated authority of the crown. The palace machinery, that vast, intricate, sometimes ruthless apparatus of private secretaries and equerries and constitutional advisers, had for the most part accommodated this expansion of her role with the institutional adaptability that was the monarchy's most reliable survival mechanism. For the most part, not everyone within the apparatus had welcomed it. This was the part of the story that the cream-colored letter in the mahogany library addressed with a directness that Anne would later describe, in her measured, understated way, as uncharacteristically candid. There were those within the palace's senior advisory structure, Figures who operated in the institutional shadows with the practiced invisibility of men who had spent decades ensuring that their influence exceeded their visibility, who had resisted Anne's elevation. Not loudly, never loudly. The resistance was the kind that worked through paperwork and procedural obstacles and the slow grinding friction of institutional inertia, the kind that could delay a decision for 6 months without ever appearing to actively oppose it. It was the resistance of people who understood that the Crown's machinery, like all complex machinery, was easiest to control when its moving parts were predictable, when its key figures were manageable, when the personalities at its center could be influenced through the kind of subtle social and political pressure that the institution had been refining since the Plantagenets. Anne was not manageable in this way. She had never been. It was perhaps the most defining fact about her, the characteristic that had shaped her public reputation and her private experience of the institution in equal measure. She did not seek approval from the apparatus. She did not soften her opinions in the presence of men in charcoal suits with clipboards. She had been known, in meetings that were supposed to produce consensus and instead produce clarity, to state her assessment of a situation with a precision that left no room for the kind of bureaucratic ambiguity in which certain palace advisors preferred to operate. She had been carrying out her duties, more duties per year than almost any other member of the royal family, year after year after year, for more than 5 decades, without complaint, without the cultivation of a public profile that might compete with the sovereign's, and without the expectation of recognition. This combination of qualities, her work ethic, her directness, her total absence of personal political ambition within the institution, made her, in Charles's assessment, irreplaceable. It made her, in the assessment of certain shadowy figures within the palace machinery, inconveniently difficult to control. Sir Geoffrey Larkspur had been in his current advisory role for 19 years. He had served under 3 private secretaries to the sovereign, and had survived the transition from Elizabeth's reign to Charles's, with the kind of seamless continuity that spoke either of exceptional professional value or of an institutional rootedness so deep that removing him had never seriously been considered. He was not a villain in any simple sense of the word. The palace machinery did not produce simple villains, because simple villains were too visible, and the institution had always preferred its most consequential figures to be invisible. He was, rather, an architect, an invisible architect of the kind of institutional conservatism that prioritizes the machinery's smooth operation above any individual's authority to challenge it. He had not, in 19 years of service, expressed a personal opinion about any member of the royal family in any document that might one day be read by someone outside his immediate circle of confidence. He had expressed those opinions through procedure, through the careful management of briefing papers, through the timing of recommendations, through the particular art of ensuring that certain conversations happened in certain rooms with certain people present and others conspicuously absent. He had not wanted Anne to be elevated. He had made this preference felt, not through any dramatic gesture, not through any statement that could be quoted or challenged, but through the slow, suffocating pressure of procedural delay and quietly engineered doubt. There had been meetings in the autumn of 2023, in the weeks when the king's first health challenges were being processed both medically and constitutionally, during which the question of enhanced powers for the councillors of state had been discussed. Anne's name had appeared in those discussions. It had been Larkspur who had introduced, with the air of a man raising a purely technical concern, the question of whether such an enhancement might create constitutional optics that the palace would struggle to manage, whether the public's perception of an unwell king delegating to his sister carried risks that the institution was not yet prepared to navigate. The argument was not without a certain procedural logic. It was also, as anyone with a clear view of the king's actual intentions understood, entirely beside the point. Charles had known about the resistance. He had, in the manner of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to read the palace machinery's signals, understood precisely what was happening and why. He had allowed the process to move at its own pace, partly because constitutional patience had been his watchword since his accession, and partly because he understood that forcing a decision through the machinery's resistance created fragility, that a change embedded in genuine procedural consensus was more durable than one imposed by sovereign fiat. But as the months accumulated and his health continued to demand its unglamorous toll, the patience had shifted into something more urgent. The letter in the cream-colored envelope was, among other things, Charles's answer to that urgency. It was his statement that the machinery's preferences were noted and declined, that the trust he had been building since a Norfolk drawing room in 1974 was not subject to the apparatus's approval, that his sister's authority within the Crown's constitutional structure was not a provisional arrangement to be reviewed by charcoal-suited advisors with clipboards, but a permanent, deliberate, historically grounded reflection of his own sovereign judgment. It was this assertion of personal royal will against the institutional machinery's calculated resistance, that had made the morning's broadcast so devastating to certain corners of the palace's senior advisory apparatus. By the time the crew at the BBC's Constitutional Affairs Unit had completed their uplink and the footage had begun its satellite journey to 47 national broadcasters, 3 separate communications had already been routed through the palace's internal messaging system, not from any royal but from within the apparatus itself, searching for the procedural lever that might still be pulled, the constitutional argument that might still be made. There was no such lever, there was no such argument. The Councillors of State Act of 2022 had already done its work. The king had already signed what needed to be signed. Anne was already, in every constitutional sense that mattered, exactly what her brother had decided she would be. The machinery had been outmaneuvered, not dramatically, not in a single decisive confrontation, but over years of quiet royal patience that had ended, this frost-white November morning, in the mahogany library with a cream-colored envelope and a burgundy wax seal and the particular undefeatable authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment for 5 decades without ever once admitting it was coming. She had never expected recognition. This was the thing about Anne that the public discourse had always struggled to accommodate, because the public discourse about royal women was constructed around a vocabulary of recognition, of ambition acknowledged, of sacrifice rewarded, of service finally seen. Anne's relationship with her service was different. It was not transactional. It did not require the completion of a circuit in which the effort eventually returned to her in the form of public appreciation. She had carried out her duties, her thousands of engagements, her decades of equestrian and charitable and diplomatic and constitutional labor, with an orientation that was, at its most fundamental level, entirely uninterested in the question of whether anyone was watching. This was not indifference. It was something much rarer and much harder to sustain. A commitment to the work itself, independent of its audience. The flashback that her staff had heard her describe, once, only once, in an unguarded moment during a long flight back from a Commonwealth engagement in the mid-1990s, was of a morning at Gatcombe Park, her Gloucestershire estate, in the autumn of 1981. Diana had been in the headlines that day. Diana was almost always in the headlines that autumn, the extraordinary spectacle of her beauty and vulnerability and global adoration playing out against the tabloid circus that had already begun to construct its elaborate and ultimately tragic relationship with her. Anne had been out early, riding across the estate in the pewter pre-dawn with only her breath and her horse's breath rising in pale clouds above the frosted pasture, moving through the particular silence of a Gloucestershire autumn morning, with the focused, uncomplicated pleasure of someone who had found the one space in her life that the institution could not reach. She had come back in to find the papers laid out on the kitchen table, every front page a variation on the same image, the same luminous face, the same breathless superlatives. She had stood there in her riding clothes, mud on her boots, the scent of horse and cold morning air still on her, and she had read each front page with a completeness of expression, a stillness, that her housekeeper, who was watching from the doorway, would later describe as neither envy nor dismissal but something almost like recognition, as though Anne were reading something she had long expected and whose arrival she had decided, long before this moment, not to let define her. She had put the papers down. She had pulled off her riding gloves. She had gone to the phone, a solid cream-colored instrument on the wall beside the kitchen window, and she had called her private secretary and confirmed her engagements for the day, which included 3 separate appearances in Wiltshire and a late afternoon meeting with a charity board in Bristol. She had attended all of them. She had been, by all accounts of those who were present, entirely present, not performing presence, but actually present, in the way that required the complete suppression of every distraction that the morning's headlines might have planted in a less disciplined mind. And she had driven home that evening, back through the darkening Gloucestershire lanes, with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done what they were supposed to do and requires no further validation of the fact. The Councillors of State Act of 2022 had been, in the monarchy's understated tradition, presented to the public as a tidying-up exercise, a piece of constitutional housekeeping necessitated by the shifting demographics of the working royal family and the need to ensure that the Crown's constitutional functions could always be performed without interruption. This was accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough to convey what the legislation actually represented in terms of the king's personal intentions. Charles had made clear, through the channels of palace communication that operated below the public waterline, that the addition of Anne and Edward to the Councillors of State was not a neutral administrative measure, but a deliberate signal, a statement about the shape of the monarchy he intended to build, a monarchy that was leaner, more efficient, and organized around a core of people whose dedication and reliability had been demonstrated over decades, rather than assumed on the basis of birth order alone. Anne had been told about the legislation before it was introduced. Not formally, not in the language of royal command, but in the way that the king communicated the things that mattered most to him, directly, personally, without intermediary, in one of the private conversations that had been the real architecture of their working relationship since long before he became sovereign. He had called her from Highgrove on a Wednesday evening in October 2022, and she had been in her sitting room at Gatcombe reading a brief from one of her charitable organizations, and when she heard his voice she had known, with the immediate instinct of someone who has been listening to the same voice through all of its registers for 60 years, that what followed would be significant. He had told her what was coming. He had told her why. And he had said with a simplicity that was, coming from him, more eloquent than any formal declaration could have been. "You've always been the one I trusted to do it properly. I want that written down somewhere, it can't be undone." She had said in response, something that the king would reproduce in the cream-colored letter. "I'm not doing it for the title." And he had replied. This too was in the letter, and when Anne read it in the mahogany library the only visible response was a brief, complete stillness, as though she were absorbing a frequency that bypassed the normal emotional circuitry. "I know. That's exactly why I want you to have it." The encrypted satellite phone on the desk beside the leather folder of constitutional instruments vibrated at 9:47 in the morning. It vibrated with the specific pattern that indicated a call from a private royal line, a double pulse, a pause, a single pulse, that the room's few occupants recognized immediately. Sir Geoffrey Larkspur, who had been standing near the window with his clipboard pressed to his chest with a tension that had been building since the burgundy seal broke, looked at the phone and then looked at Anne with an expression that was as close as his face ever came to visible discomfort. Anne looked at the phone for a single long moment. Then she picked it up. The voice on the other end was Prince William's, but it was William in a register that his public appearances had never required of him and that most people in the world would not have recognized as his. It was not the measured, carefully managed voice of the Prince of Wales executing the public role of heir to the throne. It was something raw, something that had not been processed through the filters of palace training and media preparation, a voice stripped of its sovereign authority and returned, briefly, to something closer to its origin. He said quietly, "I watched the whole thing." There was a pause that seemed longer than it was, weighted with everything that wasn't being said. Then, "She deserves this. She's always deserved this." His voice caught slightly on the word always, the single syllable carrying enough history to compress decades of complicated family dynamics into a sound that lasted less than a second. "Tell her," he said, and then stopped, as though the sentence had somewhere more important to go than any of the available words could take it. "Just tell her." Anne held the phone for a moment after the call disconnected. The bracket clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, the frost on the park railings was entirely gone now, surrendered to the morning's gradual warmth, and the iron was dark and wet and gleaming in the pale November light. She set the phone down with the careful, deliberate motion of someone completing a ritual, and she returned her gaze to the leather folder on the desk, the constitutional instruments waiting to be formally countersigned, the paperwork that would transform the morning's private ceremony into public record, the documents that would close the circuit between the king's personal trust and the institutional machinery's formal obligation to acknowledge it. There were, at this point, those within the palace apparatus who were attempting to frame the morning's events in terms that minimized their constitutional significance. A senior advisor, not Larkspur, but a figure from within the Privy Council's secretariat who had been in his role for 12 years, and whose skill at the reframing of inconvenient facts was widely admired within the institutional corridors, had already prepared a statement that characterized Anne's enhanced role as a natural and incremental development within the existing legislative framework, and emphasized the routine nature of the Councillor of State mechanism. The statement was accurate. It was also, in its precision of understatement, a masterpiece of institutional damage limitation, an attempt to drain the morning's events of their historical resonance by drowning them in procedural language. The statement was never released. It was prepared, circulated among a small group of senior advisors, and then, quietly, withdrawn. Not because anyone instructed that it be withdrawn, but because the advisor who had written it had watched the broadcast that morning, had watched Anne's face as she broke the burgundy seal, had watched her hands as they held the cream-colored pages of her brother's letter, and had understood, with the particular clarity that comes when bureaucratic language is confronted by a genuinely human moment, that the statement was not equal to the occasion, that no statement would be, that the morning had already said what it needed to say in a language more fundamental than institutional communication, in the language of a brother's trust and a sister's 50 years of undeviating service, written in a sloping hand on thick cream paper and sealed with burgundy wax in a color that was almost, in the cold November light of a mahogany library, the precise shade of something that had been preserved for a very long time and was now, finally, permitted to breathe. Buckingham Palace issued 3 words, at 11:15 that morning, through its official communications office. 3 words that had not been requested, had not been preceded by a press briefing or a media consultation or any of the normal procedural architecture of royal communications. 3 words that appeared on the official social media account simultaneously, without context or elaboration. The nation endures. It was, by any conventional measure, an inadequate response to a constitutional moment of genuine historical weight. But the 3 words had not been chosen by the communications office. They had been chosen, it would later emerge, by the king himself, from his private rooms, via a brief note delivered by hand to his press secretary at 10:58. He had written them on a small card, in the same sloping hand as the cream-colored letter, and beneath them he had added, not for publication, not for the public record, but in the private margin of a private note, 4 additional words that his press secretary would later describe, in an interview given many years after the events of that November morning, as the most purely British thing I have ever read. The 4 words were, "She always has been." Leathon formal countersigning took 11 minutes. The constitutional instruments were designed for efficient execution. The machinery was, whatever its other qualities, exceptionally good at the paperwork of power, and Anne signed each document with the same unhurried precision she had brought to everything in her public life, reading each page fully before placing her signature, asking one question about the technical language of the 3rd document that caused Sir Geoffrey Larkspur to flip through the relevant legislation on his tablet, with slightly less than his usual composure. When it was done, she capped the pen, a plain, dark-barreled instrument that she had produced from her own jacket pocket rather than accepting the ceremonially prepared pen that sat in its velvet holder on the desk, and she set it down beside the leather folder and stood back slightly, as though making room for the moment to settle. In the corridor outside the library, members of the household staff who had been conducting their Thursday morning routines with the careful normalcy that the palace machinery always preferred had paused, independently of one another, in a loose and entirely unorchestrated congregation near the library door. They had not been told what was happening inside. The morning's business was classified at a level that excluded household staff from the briefing, but they had known anyway, in the way that people who work in close proximity to historical moments develop an instinct for their approach. They stood in the corridor with the particular quiet of people who understand that they are adjacent to something larger than themselves, and they did not speak, and they did not move, until the library door opened and Anne emerged, and then, in a gesture that was entirely spontaneous, and entirely unprecedented, and entirely, somehow, right, they began to applaud. Not loudly, not in the theatrical way of people performing a tribute for the record. Quietly, with the soft, persistent percussion of genuine feeling, the kind of applause that has no performance in it at all. Anne walked through it with her characteristic composure intact, her chin level, her pace unchanged. But those who were close enough, those who were standing near enough to see past the composure, past the 50 years of disciplined public face, past the architecture of self-containment that had been the defining structure of her public life, those people saw, at the corner of her right eye, the single track of something that had been held for a long time and had now, very quietly, found its exit. She did not acknowledge it. She walked on down the corridor, toward the staircase and the car waiting on the street below and the afternoon's engagements, which included a school visit in Surrey and a meeting with the trustees of a medical research charity for which she had been patron for 31 years. She was already, by the time she reached the staircase, composing herself for the school visit, sorting through the mental preparation that a lifetime of professional royal service had made automatic, assembling the full presence of attention that she brought to every engagement regardless of what had preceded it in her day. The presence that had nothing to do with the performance of caring and everything to do with the practice of it. She was already, in other words, back to being exactly what she had always been, the most dedicated working royal in the history of the British monarchy, doing her job, requiring nothing from the world except the opportunity to continue doing it. The broadcast cut to a fixed wide shot of Clarence House's exterior, the pale Portland stone, the iron railings, the November sky pressing down, and held it for a long, unscored, uncommented moment. Across the country, in the living rooms and waiting rooms and hospital wards and school common rooms and office breakout spaces where people had gathered around screens, the silence of that exterior shot was met with an answering silence, the silence of a nation encountering, unexpectedly, in the middle of a Thursday morning, something it had not known it needed to see, something it had not known it had been waiting for. The recognition of a life of service, rendered finally visible not through ceremony or celebration but through the clean, undeniable language of constitutional fact. The screen remained on the exterior shot for 47 seconds. No voiceover, no lower third text, no music. Just the building and the sky and the particular quality of November light that falls on London when the frost has passed and the cold is still present and the day is pressing forward regardless, the light that has no poetry in it and requires none, because it is simply the light of the world continuing, which is its own sufficient statement. Then the screen went dark. No music, no commentary. No elegant summary or contextualizing narration. Just the darkness that follows the completion of something long in preparation and finally, irrevocably done. The nation had watched. The nation had understood. And somewhere in a car moving through the South London streets toward a school where 53 children were waiting with handmade signs and the particular luminous energy of young people who have been told something important is about to happen, the Princess Royal sat with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze on the window and the gray sky moving above her. And she was already somewhere else, already forward, already in the next room, already doing the next thing. She had always been this way. She had always been, as her brother had written in 4 words that the world would not read until much later, the one that endured. The truth had never needed to be hidden. It had only needed, for 50 years, to be waited for. The duty had been done, the trust had been honored. And the swallow, that ancient symbol pressed into burgundy wax on a cream-colored envelope in a mahogany library on a frost-white Thursday morning, had at last, after a lifetime of patient, unwitnessed flight, come home.